Hello everyone, this is Preston Poulter of Pocket Jacks Comics. If you're wondering why I called it Pocket Jacks Comics, is because I used to be a poker player, and that was when I got the idea to write the story that became White Lily, which was my very first comic book. And we had a term in poker if you got really upset by the result of a hand. I don't want to degenerate too much into poker jargon, but someone caught a lucky card and beat you when the odds were in your favor. We say you would go on tilt if you were really upset, because that would impact the decisions you were making later. And that's something, as a professional, you should spot. If you're sitting at a table and you see someone going on tilt, you need to play more hands with that person because they're not thinking rationally. The reason I bring this up is because comic reviewer Michael Gutierrez, writing for the ComicsGate website Bleeding Fool, reviewed my series White Lily. Actually, he didn't review the series, he just reviewed the second issue. I don't know why he started with the second issue instead of the first issue. I feel like maybe he would have had a different opinion if he would have started at the story at the beginning. But he picked up the second issue, and boy, it just set him absolutely on tilt as far as I can tell. I mean, if you look at the title, White Lily, a biography of sorts. There's a genre called historical fiction where we take historical figures and we work their lives into a narrative, a three-act structure, if you will, a beginning, a middle, and an end, all around a central conflict. And, it's a good genre. People like it. But he's acting as though what I'm doing is completely novel or kind of off the reservation, and instead I should be making a documentary in comic book form. It's kind of an insane title to basically an insane review. Let's take a look. So starting out, he says, it is presented as an empowering tale. He's going to use this a lot. I'm not sure. Well, I mean, that's something he is kind of adding to the story. I never really use that term. It's certainly not in any of my marketing literature. I've had hundreds of conversations with people at comic conventions all over the United States. And the reason I don't describe it as empowering is because empowering is entirely subjective. It's like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. If you read a trashy novel and the depiction of the abuse that you read in the trashy novel, like 50 Shades, for instance, causes you to go, oh, you know what, I don't want to be with a man like that, and you go and affect agency in your life, and you do something different, then that book empowered you, even if it was not a good book. So, I'm not really going to go, hey, this is empowering, because I'm not going to tell other people, presumably women, that their lives will be changed by this story. I'm just going to describe the story, which is about the deadliest female fighter pilot in world history, and I think that kind of inherently goes, oh, well, she had a lot of agency, and she did. It is a character with a lot of agency. It's a character who makes a lot of decisions other people, such as Mr. Gutierrez, would not perhaps approve of. But what Mr. Gutierrez goes on to do is he basically sets forth, well, an empowered woman should do this, and he then compares my writing to his mental construct of what an empowered woman should do, and he then, attacks me for not meeting his standards of what an empowered woman is. And of course, the irony here is that ComicsGate spends most of its time attacking what they were going to refer to as social justice warriors or social justice comics for perpetuating their notions of empowering, and yet Mr. Gutierrez is now blaming me for not honing my character to his version of what an empowered woman should be. Now, before we really dive into different versions of what empowered should be and how I missed Mr. Gutierrez's mark of what an empowered woman is, let's take a look at the historical figure, all right? Lydia Vladimira Litviak was born in Moscow to Jewish Polish parents. Her father was killed by her own government in the Purge under Stalin. He was a Bolshevik revolutionary and an intellectual, and Stalin did not tend to like those people, nor was Stalin particularly fond of Jews. So she lost her father to her own government, and this became the motivation she would later have to enlist in the Soviet Air Force. She was attempting to restore honor to her family name, but as you can imagine, she carried with her a great deal of rage and grief. And I feel that was very typical of people fighting under the Soviet government, because they had just gone through the purge, which wiped out 20 million people. That's a massive amount of casualties that was inflicted by their own government on their own people, and now they're there defending it. Hitler believed, there's a famous quote from Hitler, all he would have to do was kick in the door and the whole structure would collapse, because he believes that the Russians hated their own government, and they did. But the thing is, they tended to hate the Nazis even worse. And that is the real crux of the story. That's how she's fighting. She is essentially seeking agency in a very disempowered situation because she hates her government, she hates the invaders, she hates everybody. And so she's very much a character of rage. And a lot of people find that compelling. The historical figure was also engaged to a fellow flyer named Alexei Solomatin. They were engaged to be married, and then one day he crashed and died right in front of her, and that just causes her to snap. And after that, she volunteers for a series of increasingly dangerous missions, pushing herself, essentially growing this ever larger death wish that would cause her to eventually one day not return home. That's the character. That's who she was, and that's what I tried to capture and put the essence of. I wasn't really attempting to say, well, what is an empowered woman according to Mr. Gutierrez, and follow along with, what he thinks she should be. I was trying to take a person who was basically pushed to the brink in an impossible situation, and rage was fueling them. And so I put that in every interaction. I'm trying to express that rage is fueling this person, that this person is not healthy, but that in the screwed up environment she's in war, being a fighter pilot, facing, the most advanced Air Force that the world at that point had ever seen, with inferior equipment and inferior training, it was her rage that empowered her. Now, if you want to say that's an empowered figure or not an empowered figure or an empowering figure, that's on you. So you can tell Mr. Gutierrez is more or less completely on Tiller. Not only, again, has he not able to characterize it as historical fiction, but instead calls it a biography, sort of. When he starts to finally get down to the review, he basically says he gave up on the comic after the first 3 pages. We'll go over those first 3 pages. And again, since he started with issue 2 instead of issue 1, the first 3 pages was his entire exposure to White Lily before giving up on it. And it's basically the characters kind of revealing their sexuality, and apparently that just causes him to freak out. I don't know what it is about female sexuality that he finds so intimidating, but I don't know. I guess we'll have to speculate. So, to quote him, the opening panel depicts what looks like a bar filled with uniformed men and women. What it looks like? Well, if you look at the page, it tells you exactly where they are. It's Saratov Airfield Officers Club, and it's full of uniformed men and women. Why is it looks like? I told you what it was right there in the narrative box. And then the next thing I mentioned in the narrative box is that in the last issue, she beat her dogfight instructor the first time up, which historically she did do. She was such a good, naturally talented pilot that the first time she was being trained in how to dogfight, she beat her instructor. So that is something in issue 1, which, again, he didn't read. So now I have to decide what we're going to show. And if we're following male pilots, we'll just look at Top Gun, because that's a movie everybody knows. They are in a bar, and what are they going to do? Well, they're going to try and woo ladies and get laid. That's what we would expect men to do, and we wouldn't think for a moment that this was disempowering or horrible or a smear job, because that's just, I guess, what we expect male fighter pilots to do. Now I have to go, well, what about female fighter pilots? Well, I figured they pretty much would have the same motivations, right? They're in a war, people are dying, they're young, they're surrounded by a lot of members of the opposite sex, and they're probably going to want to make use of that, particularly in the Soviet Union, because there's an article I link in the description down there about the culture of sex and death, and that as communism embraced atheism and basically forced out religious morality, people became far more free with their sexuality, and they also began to kind of wonder if life basically had lost meaning. There was a lot of ennui, and not to mention they'd just gone through the purge. So the idea that these women would be out for sex, to me, seemed logical. But, well, Mr. Gutierrez felt very offended by this. Yes, he took offense instead of poking fun at all the social justice people taking offense, he took offense about women expressing some sexual aggression. So he said he gave up after 3 pages. Let's see, page 1 is literally just them in the bar with some narration boxes describing what happened back in issue 1, them toasting with vodka. So I'm going to guess that he probably didn't take a lot of issue here. And then we go to page 2, where Katya and Lilia are talking, and Katya is curious what the fighter is like because she didn't get to fly it yet. If you would have read the first issue, you would have understood that. It was only Lilia who flied the fighter, and so Lilia is relaying to Katya what it felt like, and she uses a joke. She says, "It's like penis. Look bad, feel good," which I thought was kind of humorous, but also there's kind of an undertone there that she knows Katya has this kind of lesbian crush on her, and she's kind of telling her, I'm straight. So that's the context of her joke. And then she goes on to talk about how being in such a powerful fighter, it was so fast, it was moving around, that she felt free to do anything. And that is a theme that I come back to over and over in White Lilies, because I'm trying to explain why this woman was up there defending the government that killed her father. And it's because this is the only place where she really has freedom. She has power. She has agency. It's in these powerful fighter planes. And that's why she likes to do it. Was he particularly upset about this? I don't know. All right, so let's go to the next one. So, and the next one, okay. Now we get Katya's kind of interior thoughts, and we see that Katya has a lesbian crush on Lilia. And then, Lilia, meanwhile, is eyeing Alexei. Again, historically, Alexei was the guy that she fell in love with and was engaged to. So I need to show them together to kind of marry history as close as I possibly can. So she's looking at Alexei, who is over there at the bar. I changed history to make Alexei be her dogfight instructor so they could have more screen time together. And so she's looking at Alexei, who back in issue 1, she'd just beaten a dogfight, and she's kind of got an impulsive idea. She's also competitive, and she's impulsive, and she sees that Alexei's talking with a competing woman in her squadron, and she doesn't like that. So she's looking at him, and she's like, you know what? I'm going to go get some vodka. Meanwhile, Katya is trying to work up the nerve to, say, hey, I fancy you. And so she walks up to Alexei and basically steals Alexei away from Raisa. This causes Mr. Gutierrez to just have an absolute conniption. He describes it as, "This story is a confusing wave of virtue signaling that takes the reader completely out of the story to figure out the message being portrayed." Virtue signaling? What virtue am I signaling here? Again, a virtue signal is where we have a character express something, like, for instance, racism is a hot topic, and a character will be like, well, I would never judge a person based on the color of their skin or stereotype them in any way, and that is, we will call it a virtue signal because the character is expressing something that the writer is communicating to the reader of, and you should be like that too. Lilia is not a character I at all portray as someone to emulate. She has, as I put it, a death wish, and I show that a lot. Now, I'd never have her give an expository line of, "I wish to die," because that line would be ridiculous. Instead, I show it as much as I can. She's always smoking. She's always doing impulsive things. She's always putting herself in harm's way. A lot of people find that compelling. Mr. Gutierrez interprets it as a virtue signal. So Mr. Gutierrez says, "There's a lot of history that could be taken for this book. A look at the challenging atmosphere that female military members suffered would be more than enough to make this character a likable one. Instead, we get to see how our heroine steals a fellow woman's date for a one-night stand." If he read all of issue 2, then he would have known it wasn't actually a one-night stand. I mean, initially, Lilia wanted it to be, but they end up falling in love. And, I mean, that's kind of a classic thing. If I wrote it that Lilia was looking at this guy and was like, there's a guy I'd like to marry, I think that would cause people to reject the story because that's not how we perceive young people as thinking, particularly someone carrying as much grief and rage as Lilia is. Not to mention it's conflict that causes scenes to be compelling. And in the scene, basically the aftermath of their sex scene, which is on the next page, Alexei has to overcome Lilia's natural hesitancy. Lilia's pulling away. Alexei has to overcome that. It creates conflict. It creates a compelling scene, which apparently sets off Mr. Gutierrez. As we see her recovering her clothes to return to the barracks, we again see the inconsistency in art and colors and the writing. Well, Blonde, my colorist, is a 20-year industry veteran, and the actual character, Lilia, did not have blonde hair. She peroxided it, and so, peroxided hair will tend to kind of have more variation in it, and it will also, as I would think, change more with the light. When you're in a lot of light, it's going to look one way. When you're in less, it's going to look another. So I don't know why Mr. Gutierrez is demanding that her hair look exactly the same in all different lighting situations, or why he's second-guessing blonde, but look, I'm not going to take issue with or correct blonde on his color choice. And he also says that she appears as a haggard old woman in some panels. Doesn't look haggard and old to me, but whatever. I remember in the 90s culture where villains smoked cigarettes to show how evil they are. Eventually, that turned into making the good guys into smokers to subvert expectation. This book tries to do this as well. However, by this point in the story, readers should have long abandoned the notion that we are witnessing an honorable character. What I'm trying to show in Lilia's smoking is her death impulse. Again, I don't want her to say it. I want her to show it. Why she's not an honorable character? Well, all right, let's look at the concept of honor, which is very intrinsic to warriors. Has she ever broken her word? Has she ever betrayed anyone? Why is this not an honorable character? Again, because Lilia is not doing what Mr. Gutierrez feels a woman should be doing, because her sexuality is different than I guess he feels. And that's really the thing. What is Mr. Gutierrez thinking that a woman should be doing? He never says. He just attacks my portrayal as saying, oh, well, no honorable woman would do that. He doesn't say what's dishonorable about it, nor what she should be doing. I guess in his opinion, she should be chaste and going, oh, wow, what a nice man. Let's go out for a Sunday. But A, that'd be really boring. B, that's not really how we think of as fighter pilots. So, yes, she is a woman, but she's a woman brought up in Soviet Russia. She's seen her father die. She's in an insane world, a world where she has been deprived of morality and religion, and instead people are just kind of embracing this on way. She's basically witnessing the degeneration of society, and she's a fighter pilot, which tends to make her, we would think, more aggressive, more to the point. And Mr. Gutierrez instead, again, he never says what it is he wants her to do, but I'm guessing he wants her to just be like, gee, want to go out for a Sunday someday? The next thing, and again, it's hard for me to not speculate, but he takes issue with the fact that their faces were not covered by an oxygen mask, which he says would have expected a combat fighter jet. I'm not sure if he knows what a jet is, but a jet is not something with a propeller. A propeller is a propeller-driven aircraft as opposed to a jet, which they didn't have jets in World War II, particularly not in the Eastern Front. Towards the latter part of World War II, the Germans came up with the very first jet, but that's just a historical tidbit and certainly not relevant to our story. The other thing about this that I'm trying to show is that the Yak-1 fighter, which they're flying, did not have an oxygen system. In fact, in issue 2, assuming he read the entire thing, he would say that they actually say they don't have oxygen. That's why you see them barefaced, because they don't have an oxygen mask. But the men are flying these American P-39 Airacobras, which do have oxygen masks, and so I'm kind of showing some of the inherent disadvantages of, say, being a woman and getting inferior equipment. But he feels that because you see a woman's face, it completely diffuses the dramatic tension. He doesn't explain why. He just says the second that facial features are shown, the tension is immediately diffused. He just makes a statement. He doesn't say why. Okay, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Gutierrez. I wasn't going to lie and say that they actually had oxygen. Why would you cover a woman's face, make it more difficult to differentiate between the characters? Because when you show their face, the face being the seat of people's expressions, the seat of their intensity, and, oh yeah, you need to cover that with an oxygen mask. Ugh. He then closes with, this book has a lot of great ideas depicting historical character in this medium is an excellent idea. However, there's just no clear direction as to where this book is going. If it's a biological presentation, it's failing at giving any sense of endearment towards the main character. Really what I want you to see in Lilia is a woman who needs help. She's just not been given a break. She's been abused. Her father's been killed, and she is put there on the front line, expected to die. We are supposed to feel for her as a woman who's just been thrown to the wolves, and apparently that is not at all endearing towards, for him anyway. And then I love this line. If this is a smear job, it does too much to build a character as having flaws to properly depict her as a stain in history. He's speculating that I was attempting to smear her. But again, he doesn't say what it was other than her sexual advancement, which caused him to become upset. And again, the virtue signal, I really think that it's the fact that Lilia was portrayed as sexually aggressive and Katya was portrayed as a lesbian that caused him to go off. It's these characters' sexuality that just put Mr. Gutierrez on tilt. And I just don't see any reason for this review other than that. And, you know, I love this closing line here. Perhaps try to make the challenges faced by women at this time and show how the characters are overcoming those struggles be center stage, like the fact they didn't have oxygen. Instead of making a social political commentary take front and center, he never points out what the social political commentary is. Again, I'm just having to infer he's just freaking out about their sexuality. So let's go to this. This is my favorite paragraph. Are there heroes in military history with loose morals? Absolutely. Were there same-sex couples even during those times? No doubt about it. Are there specific challenges faced by either gender in combat situations? Sure are. However, none of these challenges are depicted in the story. What? Wait a minute. Let's go over this. Are there heroes in military history with loose morals? Absolutely. And I've shown you Lilia with loose morals, have I not? Were there same-sex couples during those times? No doubt about it. And I showed you that Katya has these lesbian feelings towards her. Are there specific challenges faced by either gender in combat situations? Sure. And I'm going over the challenges of what it's like to be a woman in war. However, none of these challenges are depicted in the story because he says so. Instead, we get a bland cut and paste narrative. Cut and paste narrative. Cut and paste narrative. Like, can you point to a single story that has a plot line like this one? Please, I want to read it. I would love to read it. A cut and paste narrative. Like I said before, if this is a biological piece intended to empower women in the military, it falls short of coming anywhere near that objective. If this was intended to smear this historical figure, then it does a great job at that. So in this sentence, he's saying, I did a great job at smearing this historical figure. In the prior paragraph, he said, if this is a smear job, it does too much to build the character as having flaws to properly depict her as a stain in history. So he's not even being consistent in his own reviews between two separate paragraphs. Again, as far as I can tell, the sexuality I depicted in the comic book just set this guy on tilt. Comics skaters like to say comics are for everyone, unless you're a lesbian or a little slutty. But hey, maybe I got it wrong. You decide. These comic books are available as a pay whatever you want. Could be free. Go over to Drive-Thru Comics. There's a link on my website, pocketjackscomics.com. You can go, you can read issue 1 and 2 without paying a cent, and come back and tell me, you know what, Preston, you're an absolute hack writer. Okay, fine. Fair enough. If you'd like, you can go to my website, Pocket Jacks Comics. You can put in your email address to subscribe to my email newsletter. I've got a great new series coming out, Guinevere and the Divinity Factory. It's going to be a lot of fun. See you on the flip side.